All right, folks, by my clock, it is 5:04 p.m., so we'll go ahead and get started. So thank you all for coming. This is I believe, the fourth in our NatSec Nightcap series. We're excited today to have Senator Saxby Chambliss, former vice chairman of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence. For those of you that don't know Senator Chambliss, he began his congressional career when he was elected in the '94 Republican Revolution in the House of Representatives. He served over 4 terms in the House, where he developed a reputation as a pragmatic problem solver and a highly skilled legislator. He served on the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence and chaired the Subcommittee on Terrorism and Homeland Security in both the lead up to and the immediate aftermath of the 9/11 attacks. In 2002, he was elected to the United States Senate, and on a message of a strong national defense and a commitment to Homeland Security, went on to serve 2 terms in the Senate. And again, as mentioned earlier, rose to serve as a vice chairman of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence. Today, is a partner at DLA Piper, one of the world's largest multinational law firms, where he counsels high-level clients through the challenges of questions at the intersection of law, policy, and business. So just a reminder, as we always do on these calls, about 35, 40 minutes in, we'll start taking questions from the audience. So please go ahead and weigh in on the Q&A section. I see a lot of good friends of ours. I see Matt Olson out there, and Jack Livingston, I know, work with the senator. So it's great to have you all, and a lot of our folks from NSI and other folks, Ambassador Sada Cumber there from the Bush administration. Thank you all for coming. Senator, we'll just thank you for coming. We'll just jump right in. You served 4 terms in the House, 2 terms in the Senate. We're obviously in a crazy time as a country. Everyone's working from home. We're under quarantine. We're starting to come out of it. Your state, Georgia's been out of it a little earlier than some of the rest of us. Talk to us about how you see the current threat situation in the world today, how it looks from where you're sitting, and from your former role on the Intelligence Committee, both in the House and the Senate. How do you feel the world looks today to you on the outside?
Well, first of all, thanks, Jamil, for having me on. And I'm glad you mentioned all those folks, my dear friends, are out there looking. They're the ones that whatever success I had, you can attribute it to the Matt Olson, the Jack Livingstons of the world, because they were great folks to work with. And Jack, of course, was my counsel on the sissy. You know, it is a strange world today. As I was thinking about what we were going to talk about, you alluded to the fact that I chaired the subcommittee on terrorism and homeland security, and leading up to 9/11, and then subsequent there too. And all of our focus from a national security perspective all of a sudden was changed. We were changed from a world in which we were used to having boots on the ground, defending ourselves with weapons, firing bullets and whatnot, and that changed all of a sudden. As a part of that change, we had to consider, particularly as we were going into Iraq, that there was another danger out there, and the danger was biological weapons and other weapons of mass destruction. So it's kind of interesting that we got through that phase of the world of terrorism and terrorists without having any attack, at least on U.S. domestic soil. We've seen some, obviously, in Syria and other places. Right. But we're in a situation where we're in a pandemic, where there's a virus that has totally crippled the economy of the United States in some ways. And we're trying to figure out how we get out of this. And as soon as we get out of it, what's going to happen next? What's going to be the next COVID-19? If we knew that, you and I would be geniuses. If we could patent that, we'd be rich forever. You know, we've always tried to project, particularly from a national defense perspective, where's the next hotspot going to be? Who's going to be the next primary opponent out there? And every time we've been in that position, every time we've tried to think about that, every time we have basically guessed at who it might be or where it might be, we've been wrong 100% of the time. So right now, as we think about where we are, I think it is important from a lessons learned standpoint here to think about the fact that we've learned how to deal with a pandemic in a short period of time. This is not going away. This is a world that we're going to live in for the immediate term, and who knows, maybe a long term. And I think policymakers, I think executive branch individuals, I think all the way down to the state and county level, there needs to be a reflection on what has happened to the country, and if this comes back again, what did we do right? The things we did wrong, let's make sure we don't do those again. So I think it continues to be a dangerous world from the standpoint of this particular incident. I won't call it an attack, but this particular incident, and it could be somebody else coming at us with another biological attack that is intentional.
Right. Well, now that folks have seen our vulnerability, right, there may be a sort of an increased desire to take advantage of the situation and utilize it. So how do we think about the sort of prospects of nation states like China and Russia taking advantage of the situation? We know that they obviously are involved in both overt and covert messaging around not just COVID, but the protests that we've seen over the course of the last weeks, based obviously on issues here in this country. But we've seen, the foreign ministry of China speaking out about whether Black Lives Matter or not. It's amazing the Chinese care. They don't care what they're doing to Muslims in their country, but they're really focused on what we're doing in our country. It is an odd situation to see that from a totalitarian regime. How much of that is them trying to play for a leadership role in the world and try to take advantage of our situation, and how much of that is just sort of the usual politics of nation states going up against one another, or is that the same thing?
No, I don't think it's the same thing. Here, at least at this point in time, we don't think that this was an intentional act on the part of the Chinese.
Right.
But suffice it to say, they quickly capitalized on it. When they saw the vulnerability of Americans suffering economically, they have really seized on that. And, Xi Jinping has made it very plain. He's been very public about the fact that he wants China to dominate economically and militarily all around the world. And whatever it takes to do that, he's going to do it. And I think here what you've seen is China's recovered. They're opening back up. We'll never know the full story, irrespective. You can send 1,000 doctors and there are 1,000 research scientists into China. We'll still never know exactly what happened, but the Chinese know.
Right.
And if they see this sign coming again, you can believe they'll act even earlier than what they have now from an economic standpoint. The Russians it's a little bit different there, and that some of the same issues that we're having relative to the spread of this virus. So the Russians haven't been able to this point to take advantage of us maybe in some ways that the Chinese have. But you can rest assured of one thing: we can't trust either one of them, and we've got to assume that those countries, as well as the Irans and the North Koreans of the world, are going to try to take advantage of every single negative thing that happens in the United States. Here, they do have the advantage of the protests coming in the aftermath or in the middle of, however you look at it, of COVID-19. And anytime the United States, particularly at the top echelon of the administrative and legislative bodies, are focused on something else other than China and Russia, the Russians and the Chinese gloat on that. And they love to see us being worried about something other than them.
Right.
So again, they're going to do everything they can to take advantage of this, and it'll be in different ways, whether you're looking at it from a Russian or Chinese perspective. But the economics of it are particularly what they're looking at from both standpoints.
Should we be worried if the Russians are facing a serious situation in their country with COVID, as it looks like they might be? And we know the Iranians are obviously having a very hard time with all their legislators and senior government officials who are affected with the virus, or were affected at one point. Should we be worried that they're going to do things externally, sort of lash out to distract their populations? We've seen Putin do it when he was unpopular in Russia. He struck out against Crimea. We know the Iranians make a business out of doing this in Iraq and raising issues around the region in order to sort of distract their own population and build sort of national pride. Is that a situation we should be worried about, particularly with the Russians and and the Iranians? And if so, what about the North Koreans? Do we have a worry there too? Because we haven't heard a lot about COVID in North Korea, and we haven't heard a lot about sort of nuclear weapons or missile launches recently from the North Koreans, you know, with exceptions here and there.
Well, the one thing that you can always say about the Russians, the Chinese, the Iranians, and the North Koreans, you never know what they're going to do.
Right.
We don't have the coverage we'd like to have from an intel gathering standpoint in a couple of those countries. So it's very difficult to try to predict what they're going to do. Suffice it to say, though, that the Russians have a very similar problem that we do with the COVID-19. And for them to take any kind of military action or external action of any sort, I think would be taking a real risk. And the one thing about Putin is he has been a risk taker to his advantage, but taking a risk right now with what's happening to the Russian people, and I'm sure particularly with the Russian army, would not be a smart move on his part. So I doubt that you're going to see something like that. As soon as I say that, they'll do something crazy tomorrow.
Right. Well, you know, speaking of that, you know, we've seen obviously the Pentagon for the same reasons, you know, with challenges with COVID, canceling major exercises and the like. Obviously, we know what happened on the aircraft carrier. You know, should we be concerned that America's own capability to address potential military issues, putting this at one side, whether we want to use a military element of power, and we've obviously seen changes in the way that the prior President Obama, used that capability. And we know that President Trump is more reticent, like President Obama was, to use the military capability, although in certain circumstances he might. Should we be concerned from a preparedness perspective that the military and the intelligence community might be hampered by, you know, not just sickness issues, but, you know, not being able to work in SCIFs and coming to the office and shift work and the like? Is that something we ought to be concerned about also in this context?
Well, the military community and the intelligence community are both very adaptable entities, and whatever the situation is, you can rest assured they're going to be the first ones to adapt to it. But here's what concerns me about where we are militarily with the COVID situation being like it is. Number one, it has to impact our readiness. As you say, we've had to cancel a number of training missions. That in and of itself will have a direct impact on readiness. But more significantly, if you've got 20%, I don't know what the number might be, what the highest number's been at any base, but if you have 20% or 15% or even 10% of your brigade or even your platoon infected with this disease, then that's going to pretty well knock you out of being able to go out on your regular training missions on a day-to-day basis. And if that persists over a long period of time, and here we are 3 months into this, then readiness is going to suffer. The second part of it, Jamil, that really concerns me is that Congress is spending money like crazy. Now, we can argue about whether or not everything they're doing is the right thing to do, but it really doesn't matter. They're doing it. And that's money that's going to be taken away from something. And the big part of the discretionary budget is defense. So the defense budget is going to be a prime target to help pay for some of the COVID activity that's going on right now. There again, that impacts not just readiness, but it impacts your ability to backfill on weapon systems and R&D and whatever else may be done from a military perspective.
It's almost the reverse problem of what you all talked about when you looked at the post 9/11 era, where we tried to capitalize on the peace dividend and had walked back some of our intelligence and military capabilities in the 90s, right? Here, it's a different situation. We may have to cut our military intelligence budgets in order to pay for the trillions of dollars we're spending on COVID, but the result may be the same, that we're less prepared to anticipate the changes in the environment, whether it's the rise of a new form of terrorism or the rise of China or AI or quantum or whatever the thing might be. And that could be a significant concern is what I hear you saying. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, it is. Through the Clinton years, we saw a downsizing of the military. We saw reductions in military spending. And did that handicap us going into 9/11? Sure. We can't pinpoint exactly where, maybe, but it had to. Right. And then coming out of 9/11, gosh, we never asked for anything within the intelligence community that the Bush administration didn't give us. So, you know, you have that ebb and flow of results from military spending or reductions in increase or reduction in military spending, sure.
And it does feel like we're sort of in a scenario where we've forgotten about how sort of awful those terrorist attacks were on 9/11 and the fact that we have been relatively safe without a major terrorist attack on US soil in the last, 20 some odd years. We've seen changes in the law. We saw the FISA modernization effort that you were part of, but then we've also seen in the last year expiration of some of these authorities that in the past have come close to expiration or even expired for a few days. But we're in a situation now where we've gone months in a pre-9/11 state of some of the core post-9/11 authorities. What issues does that raise for the intelligence community and for our ability to protect not just against terrorist threats, but other threats to other national security threats to our nation?
The one positive thing that came out of 9/11 was that, particularly in the short term thereafter, we really saw Republicans and Democrats go shoulder to shoulder and say, you know, this country's got issues. We got problems from a military national security standpoint, from an intelligence national security standpoint, and we got to fix this. And we did. And we had serious discussions as well as serious negotiations, and the spending of money was done in the right way. And the policies that we enacted were the kind of policies that allowed America to be safe and secure for the next 20 years, as we have seen and you alluded to. We can't afford to get away from that because there are more bad guys out there today than ever before. They're more creative, they're smarter. The technology is 1,000 times better on their side as well as our side. So I think as we look at where we are today, we need to remember where we were coming out of 9/11 and make sure that that we don't allow ourselves to evolve back into a situation where we're not committing the resources, we're not committing the right kind of personnel to ensure that safety and protection, because Americans have gotten used to that. Right. And they should be used to it. And we can't afford to slip back into any kind of position of weakness there.
Yeah. Well, you made a point about how Democrats and Republicans in the post-9/11 era came together and sort of found common ground, particularly on these intelligence and national security issues. It does feel like, though, at this time in this country, we're in a very partisan situation, we're in a very politicized situation, putting aside even all the domestic stuff that's happening and all the challenges there. Just on the national security side, after what happened in 2016 with the Russians and the challenges that caused in the investigation and the like, at least in the House, it's been definitely a very politically charged environment. The president and the White House haven't necessarily helped that much with the Twitter and the tweets and the conversation. And yet in the Senate, we have seen sort of a bipartisan effort with Senator Burr before he had to step aside temporarily, and Senator Warner. How can we explain the difference between what's going on in the House and the Senate, you having served in both? And is that something that that should be a lesson for us looking at how to deal with intelligence issues going forward in the post-COVID environment where, as you say earlier, China is making a move?
The House is designed by the Constitution to be very partisan, to be more head-butting, to have more of an opportunity to scream and holler about the other side. And that's always been the case. You can go back and you can read books on Jefferson or Adams or whoever, and if we'd had a 24/7 news cycle back then, you probably would have seen some of the same things we're seeing now. But there's clearly no question but what the partisanship, particularly in the House, has gotten much, much worse than what it was 25 years ago when I got there. The Senate side was always calmer, more collegial. And the 60 vote rule made it that way.
Mm-hmm.
You had to have folks on the other side working with you. Now, with us getting away from the 60 vote rule on executive noms and judicial noms, and conversation about elimination of the 60 vote rule on the legislative calendar, which I hope does not happen, has just created more and more of a partisan situation that I don't know how we get out of it. And I think what you have seen, Jimmy Hill, is you've seen the Senate become more like the House from a pure political partisanship situation. Right. Now, there are exceptions, and I'm very proud of Senator Burr and Senator Warner, and I've had a conversation with Senator Rubio in the last couple of weeks. He's going to continue the attitude that Senator Burr has had us in relative to working in a very bipartisan way, because we all know that bad guys and dealing with bad guys is not a partisan issue.
Right.
And he's fortunate, Senator Burr is fortunate to have somebody who is a believer like Senator Warner and is able to convince his conference or his caucus to come along with him on major issues. FISA reform is a good example of that. And you saw the Senate do what I thought was a very judicious approach to FISA reform. I wish things had remained in there that didn't remain in there, but be that as it may. But then you get back over to the House, and all of a sudden, that's where it breaks down. You and I were talking earlier.
Right.
Nancy Pelosi is the advocate for FISA reform. Give me a break.
Right.
But she is right now. So, you know, the differences between the House and Senate have always been there, and that's not going to stop.
Right. Well, so, you know, it is interesting, though, that we have sort of gone down this rabbit hole. We see even challenges within each party where each party is being drawn to the edges of the party, right? That's sort of that classic national security consensus that existed for a long time, even post-9/11, but even before that in the Reagan era, right, where Democrats and Republicans were able to find middle ground on some of these issues. It does feel like that is significantly weakened. And how much of that is just pure partisanship and electoral, you know, aspects and the like is hard to know. But I guess I wonder, given that we are in this environment today, and we're dealing with the threat of COVID, right, and dealing with whatever the next pandemic might look like, but we're seeing a rising China. Is there any chance that the rise of China or some situation with North Korea or Iran or Russia might bring the country back together? Or are we just so far gone that it's going to take another election, maybe two elections, before we get out of sort of the current partisan environment and get back to an era where the folks, at least on national security issues, might be able to find some common ground? Well,
clearly it's the most partisan atmosphere that we've had, particularly during my 25 years, but I think it extends back a lot further than that. The one thing that has always brought us together is a military conflict, and Lord knows, I hope that is not the next incident that happens that brings us together. You're seeing, I think, more of an attitude in the Senate today about trying to make things happen in a bipartisan way than what you saw maybe last year, the year before that. I don't necessarily see that in the House, but in hearing my colleagues, my former colleagues in the Senate talk, and I visit with them regularly, I think there is an undercurrent that we've got to make some changes and we got to get back on track. There are too many problems out there. So that's kind of what I'm hearing, and I hope that is what materializes, certainly.
Right. That's what I mentioned the audience in about 5-8 minutes here. We're going to take questions from the audience. I see there's already 3 questions there now. Feel free to put your questions in the Q&A section. We'll get to those here in just about 5-7 minutes. So Senator, one interesting question I want to ask about sort of what we're doing in this post-COVID era and the like. You know, how should we be thinking about what the economic situation looks like? I think there's a lot of folks who are obviously very concerned about the impact that COVID has had on the economy here domestically, but also the world's economies, right? We see challenges in all of our major trading partners. China seems to be recovering, coming out of it sooner than others. but a lot of other of our trading partners are still suffering through this. And we see, the developing world and South America and Asia and Africa starting to go through this now. Should we be worried about the economics writ large, or is there any cause for hope? I mean, is there a prospect of coming out of this and being successful? And is there optimism that might be out there to be found in what is otherwise a dark looking environment?
Jamil, what has happened over an extended period of time, and it's been a number of years, the Chinese have played this game of capturing the manufacturing sector, capturing the textile sector, capturing the pharmaceutical sector. And all of a sudden, we're thrown into this pandemic. And the whole world now realizes that they are way too dependent on the Chinese for things that they need and use every single day, from pharmaceuticals to computer chips. And what I am hopeful for, and I know there's a lot of conversation going on about this between us and our friends around the world, that there needs to be a world reaction to this. There needs to be a concerted effort on the part of not just the United States. We will lead the charge,
right?
But there will be a worldwide effort to ensure that we don't ever let ourselves get put in this position again, where we're totally dependent on the Chinese for penicillin, for example, or we could name any number of other drugs, or at least the ingredients that go into drugs, irrespective of where they're manufactured. We can't do that by ourselves, and we shouldn't. But if the world reacts in the right way, there will be a lot of positive things that come out of this, and you'll see economies in third world countries all of a sudden start to play in this trade game that have never been in the game before. And I think, obviously, that would be good. I think if there's one continent that has the real potential to benefit from this, it's Africa. Africa is a continent that is a very poor continent if you look at it from a wholesale basis, but it's also a continent that is rich in people and numbers. It's rich in natural resources, and they have a lot of opportunity to really develop as a result of all this. And I hope from their standpoint they do, but I think you're going to see a reaction from folks around the world, not just from the United States, about let's ensure that this doesn't happen again.
Interesting. So as we're looking at that, does that mean that we may see a resurgence of domestic manufacturing, or at least more Western manufacturing, instead of all shipping it out to China? And if that's the case, whether that's pharmaceuticals or computer chips or being able to have a trusted foundry, or making sure we have access to rare earth metals, or all those huge national security issues, if we're going to do that, that's going to come at some cost, right? We won't have the discount Chinese labor and the huge labor pools to pull from. How are we going to work through that as a society here in America? Do we have the talent? Have we we've talked a lot about retraining, right? You've seen this in Georgia alone, but in places you've traveled around the country, right? There are communities that have suffered from the change in manufacturing, the loss of American auto manufacturers, the loss of American steel. Have we retrained those folks to be ready, or their children to be ready for sort of jobs in the new economy and being able to deliver these goods again, if we're not going to rely on China? Is that realistic to expect?
Yeah, I think it is. And I think people are going to have to be of that mindset. I was with a textile manufacturer the other day, and he said that he's not really a manufacturer. 100% of their goods are manufactured by other people. They are distributors, basically. Okay. But he said he resources about 10 to 15% of his product from China today. And that this time next year, it will be 0%.
Wow.
I think you're going to see more and more of that. I think you're going to see manufacturing brought back to the United States. To Donald Trump's credit, he's talked about this from day one.
Right.
And has been willing to put some incentives in place to try to bring manufacturing back to the United States. Those jobs they're not the cut and sew operations that the textile facilities in Georgia used to do day to day. The jobs that he's talking about bringing back and the jobs in manufacturing in about any industry today are so highly technical and they're so highly computerized that they're going to be high paying jobs. They're going to be good benefit jobs. They're going to be with good companies. So it's going to be a different day in the manufacturing sector. It's not going to happen overnight. It's going to take years to do. But I think as we pull out of this, that there are going to be Americans who are going to think, yeah, I'm willing to pay a little bit more money for that widget if it's made in the U.S. And they're going to be widget manufacturers coming back here.
Awesome. That would be amazing. So I do see we've got some questions from the audience, and I did say we'd go to them. So let's start with some of those there. So I see Lori Gordon, one of our visiting fellows at NSI, who also serves the Aerospace Corporation. She wants to talk about space programs. And obviously, we just saw the recent SpaceX launch, first time in seven or 9 years that we've launched Americans from American soil to the International Space Station. And she asked about, given the budget strain from current challenges, do we think that's going to cause a challenge in space programs? And if it does, are we likely to favor national security space, right? All the satellites that we launch for SIGINT or for imagery intelligence and the like, versus human spaceflight. Obviously, we've seen a recent big success from the U.S. here in human spaceflight. Is there gonna be a debate about sort of the must-haves on the national security side versus the nice-to-haves on human spaceflight? And if so, does that change the space program environment in the budget in this new sort of post-COVID constrained budget era?
Well, from a space exploration standpoint, there's always been that tugging and pulling between sending a man to the moon or R&D satellites up. So you'll always have that. But you know, after all we've been through for 2 months, whatever the time period was when the space flight went up, didn't you as an American feel good when those two astronauts
Absolutely.
were there and taking off, and you see the rocket with all the flares behind it and whatnot? It just gave you a great feeling as an American in a very difficult time in the history of our country. So I personally was glad to see us start the space program back up again. Most people, and we used to hear this argument as policymakers when we were arguing about the budget over the space program. Most people just have no idea of the healthcare related R&D that goes on in every space flight we make. There probably have been lots of lives saved as a result of what we've done with our space program through the years. So,
right.
Will there be demands on the budget from both sides? Sure. Should we make sure that the manned space flights continue? I think so. But I know, and you know, from a national security standpoint, we can't live without having our satellites gathering information from our friends and our foes in space. And the Chinese and the Russians are getting more sophisticated in the way that they are able to come after our satellites. So there's a lot of technology that we have to keep up with as a result of that to make sure that they're safe and secure while they're in space. So we're going to have to keep spending a lot of money on our space program. It's only going to grow.
Right. And it has been interesting to watch the sort of the public discussions now about the challenges to our satellites and sort of concerns about what the Russians are doing and the like. And, you know, obviously we can't get into a lot of the detail on that, but it is obviously very concerning given how much we rely on those space assets. Harold Moss, one of our visiting fellows, wants to come back to this rare earth metals question. He's interested to know, as we think about jobs and industry come back to the U.S., obviously one of the things we need to do some of this stuff, particularly in a high tech environment, are these rare earth metals. And we know that China's cornered the market on a significant chunk of them. There's some in Afghanistan, but, you know, obviously the challenges in Afghanistan are what they are. And then in the U.S., you know, we have this one mine in California that's gone in and out of bankruptcy. What steps can or should we be thinking about taking to address, in particular, this rare earth gap that not a lot of people are talking about, but we all know, particularly for national security applications and technology applications, could be a huge gap for us?
Yeah, the world of technology particularly is being impacted by that issue today. if we don't protect ourselves from a resource standpoint, then technology and our ability to manufacture the latest and greatest item out there is certainly going to be impacted. There's a lot of conversation about the rare earth issue, but I'll be honest, I don't think policymakers in Washington have enough of an understanding to really grasp the potential seriousness of this issue. I'm not an expert on it,
right?
But even what little bit I know about it tells me that if we don't get our arms around this, then it's just like China having 100% of the penicillin manufactured that comes into the United States.
Right.
We can't depend on the Chinese to get our rare earth. They want to dominate, as we talked about earlier. This is one of those other long-term issues where the Chinese are planning for 10, 15, 20 years from now that will be a piece of their ability to dominate if we're not careful. So the issue needs to be addressed by Congress, but it's not a real exciting issue, and that's why policymakers have a hard time getting it.
Well, this is one of our challenges as a country. We are so innovative because we're looking at tomorrow, the next week, the next month, next year, maybe even. The Chinese are looking at 15, 20, 30, 40 years. It presents a challenge for us, planning on that time horizon.
Yeah, we look to the next election.
Right.
And the Chinese look for 15 or 20 years from now. You're right.
Yeah. So Susan Connolly asked a question sort of both about the military and the intelligence community. And we've seen a ton of criticism directed at the IC. You were, I know, viewed as an advocate for the IC, and when you had to reform it, you did, but do it in a way that was productive for them. We've seen extensive criticism of the military and the IC coming from both sides of the political aisle, but also from the White House. How do you view that criticism? Is that causing challenges for the intelligence community, the military? Is the intelligence community still able to do its job effectively, or does it hurt morale in those places? The sort of partisanship and the criticism from all around, including the top of the leadership.
Well, you always worry about morale in every agency, and that was one of the constant questions that I used to ask from an intel perspective when we had folks on the Hill testifying. And today, I'm on several intelligence community advisory boards, and I still ask that question, because if morale is not good within any institution, then either short term or even worse in the long term, it's going to really be a handicap to you. So morale is extremely important. Criticism, if it's justified, will not affect morale, because the folks inside will know that criticism is justified.
Right.
But if criticism is not justified, then people inside the intelligence community feel helpless because there is no public relations arm of the intelligence community that can jump out there and say, whoa, wait a minute, that's not right. Let me tell you what's really happening here. And we saw this with the Snowden incident.
Right.
All of a sudden, I'm sitting watching 60 Minutes one night, and Greenwald comes on and interviews Snowden, and they start talking about some things happening that I know can't happen. There's no way that could be true. But because the intelligence community was not set up to have that PR to come out on the other side, there were a lot of people who believed that was the gospel, and it was hard to ever hear the other side. And it fell to individual policymakers like Senator Feinstein and myself to be front defending the community. And those things, they hurt, but by the same token, when they hear people who really know what's going on talking about what truly is happening inside of those institutions, then that's certainly a big help to the morale side of it.
Right.
We've been very fortunate in our intelligence community. You mentioned Matt's on the phone. Matt's one of those folks I'm talking about. The leadership that we've had at all of our 3-letter agencies, and Matt ran a 4-letter agency, and the leadership today is, I think, as good as it's ever been across the spectrum.
Right.
And when you have good leadership, then you're going to have good morale. And I think that's what we're seeing today, and that's what we've got to keep developing, are those good leaders.
Well, you know, one of the interesting things you point out about sort of what happened in the post-Snowden world, and you know, when the original sort of terror surveillance program was leaked, you know, I work for General Alexander today at his private sector company in my day job, and he always likes to tell the story about George Bush coming to NSA. You know, and NSA, I always feel like they're sort of like the nerdy kid in high school who can never really defend himself. He keeps getting kicked, you know, and keeps getting kicked by the bullies. I mean, he really can't defend himself. He doesn't have a good PR shop because they never talk about what they do. But so General Alexander talks about President Bush coming to NSA, and you know, he gets the car with him, and President Bush says to him, "Listen, I told you what to do. You keep doing what you're doing. You do the right thing for the country. I'll take the bullets." You know, and you know, that kind of leadership feels like both in Congress and elsewhere. It doesn't feel like there's that kind of leadership. And I agree with you that the career leadership and Gina Haspel at CIA and Paul Nakasone at NSA, obviously, you know, terrific leaders. But what about the political leadership? You know, whether it's the chair and ranking in the House and the Senate, or the leadership in the House, the Senate, or even the White House. I mean, should we be concerned that leaders aren't defending their people at this point, and it's become just a partisan brawl? Like, is that something that should be worrying us as a country, put aside the intelligence community itself?
Well, it is a concern, and unfortunately, the intelligence community has gotten more politicized today than ever before, and I attribute a lot of that, frankly, to the Snowden disclosures. It raised the ire of folks in Washington, particularly on the far right and the far left, and it's awful unusual to see those sides, those far right, far left sides, get together.
Right.
You'll look at the individuals in the House and the Senate who raise the most cane about surveillance programs or whatever the issue may be. They're people who don't agree on anything else, but this exactly. They agree on, that it's and for different reasons. Their rationale is different, but still they think we ought to eliminate this program or that program within the intelligence. But you know, I was very concerned about President Trump getting off on the wrong foot with the intelligence community. The more you listen to him, the more you realize that he was not talking about the current IC. He wanted to complain about the previous leadership or programs that had been in existence. But unfortunately, that doesn't get filtered out. And I do have concern about that, and I know that there are a lot of folks who are working hard to make sure that he has a thorough understanding about the importance and the significance of each and every individual in all of our IC agencies, because let me tell you, these are some of the most professional, some of the most dedicated individuals that live in our country today.
Right.
Put their life in harm's way to a great extent every single day.
Right.
And, they are really true American heroes.
So thank you, sir. Well, so Larry Pfeiffer, who runs our sister center over at the Schar School, the Hayden Center, and served as chief of staff to General Hayden when he was at CIA, asked about the recent declassification. We've obviously seen the current DNI Ratcliffe today declassified a number of documents associated with the so-called Obamagate effort. Rick Grinnell, before him, the acting DNI, had done something similar. But of course, we've seen declassifications for a long time. We saw a lot of declassification in the post-Snowden environment by the Obama administration, and under Congress declassified a lot of documents about the Bush administration and the lead up to 9/11 in the investigation of the 2001 terrorist attacks. How much of this is sort of DC folks just protecting one another or sort of outing folks, and how much of this is real good congressional oversight? And again, coming back to this question of partisanship, is this a partisan thing? Is this really oversight? Is this sort of revealing bad things that happen and being transparent about that? What's going on here?
Well, my view about declassification is that it's always good to be very transparent with the American people. But very honestly, there are some things that should be kept out of sight of the American people, because we have to deal with allies, and sensitive information oftentimes involves sources and methods, which is a common term used in the IC, that needs to be protected, but also our allies need to be protected. I always came down on the side of, let's redact it and don't declassify it unless it's an absolute necessity. And if the American people don't know about it, then you're not hurt by it, because if it's declassified for political reasons, that's wrong. If it's declassified because it's something that truly the American people need to understand, and it does not impact a relationship with an ally, does not impact the sources and methods, disclosure, that's an entirely different matter. And okay. Some of what we're seeing now, some of what we saw during the previous administration was declassification for political purposes, and I don't think that's right.
Right, makes sense. So Wayne Anderson, and by the way, folks, we will end right on time. I'll be respectful of people's time, so we'll end right on time at 10 minutes from now at 6 o'clock Eastern. Wayne Anderson asks about a statement that you made at one point, and I think you said something similar today, that the security of the United States is, which relies on accurate time and intelligence, is not a Republican or Democratic issue. You said something fairly similar to that today. Do you think that view needs to be updated to account for today's environment, where individual legislators are a lot more influential and may have to do less with party priorities and more sort of their personal view, whether it's I'm a libertarian and I think surveillance is terrible, or I'm very liberal and I believe that surveillance is bad because it's going to affect minorities or minority points of view. Is it really no longer a Republican or Democratic issue? Is it more about individuals? And if so, is there a way to rebuild that consensus that you were alluding to there?
Well, this goes back to what we were talking about relative to some members of both the House and the Senate who are on the far right and the far left, who join together on specific issues relative to intelligence, and the rationale is different, but the end result they want is the same. I think when you have those kind of discussions and you have those kind of debates, it's good. It's good because it shows the diversity in this country. It shows that there is a different mindset today from what there was on September the 2nd, September the 12th, 2001. And all of the ideas that you can lay on the table and debate and discuss relative to whether it's intelligence collection or use of the intelligence that is collected is good. And if you have views on the far right and the far left, that's usually means you're going to build a consensus of Republican Democrats in the middle. I used to have a good friend in the House, John Tanner from Tennessee, who was my law school classmate. He and I were having a discussion one night, and he said, Saxby, this place is crazy here. There are 435 of us, and you're a Republican and I'm a Democrat. And if we took 20% on the right and 20% on the left and took their ideas out of it, and we took that 60% that's in the middle of Republicans and Democrats, boy, could we really get some good things done. And thank goodness in the world of intelligence, and I think you saw this in the FISA discussion, both the House and the Senate, with Republican and Democratic support on the FISA reform bills, even though they were different. I think it was a good discussion, a good debate, and at the end of the day, you did have Republicans and Democrats coming together to do what they thought was right.
Right. Do we feel like that sort of 40% on the edges and 60% in the middle? Do we feel like that number is different today, and it's more flipped, that it might be 40% in the middle, maybe even 20% in the middle, and the extremes have become larger, or is that just a misperception from the outside?
Well, I think the extremes are becoming larger. In '94, it was probably 10% and 10%, and today it's I have no idea what the number is, but It's more than that.
Yeah. Well, so Bryson Bort, one of our visiting fellows at NSI, or actually one of our senior fellows now at NSI, and the CEO of a great cyber startup, asked about election security. He says the government's done a great job responding to what happened in 2016 now, and really working with states and locals on technology and programs. But one concern he still has is about public trust and perception. What else can be done on the public trust and perception side to address sort of foreign and domestic disinformation efforts around the upcoming election? Is there anything we can do about that?
Well, one thing that I think can be done and should be done, and General Naxoni and I have had this conversation over and over many times, what the community did, particularly the NSA, with the election security in 2018 is a great story that should be told to all Americans. There have been bits and pieces of what happened that have come out, but suffice it to say that we had a task force at NSA that figured out what the Russians were doing, and they made sure that at the end of the day, they had no impact on the election outcome.
Right.
The American people don't trust government to start with. And if you talk about enough that Russians have interfered in the election and we weren't able to totally shut them out in 16, for example, and they may or may not have had an influence, all of that conversation goes to build up that lack of trust. And I think the more transparent we can be and the more information we can get out here, we're talking about declassifying things, the more information like that you can get out. It's not political. It's just about allowing the American people to know and understand that you've got good, dedicated people who are working hard to make sure that our elections are not impacted by third parties like the Russians or the Chinese. And believe you me, we heard about the Russians, but don't think for a minute the Chinese and North Koreans and the Iranians are not trying to interject themselves into our elections just like the Russians are.
Right.
We're the enemy of the free world, and we're always going to have those attacks come at us.
Sure. Stephen Jackson, one of our former students at George Mason Scalia Law School, asked about Africa and Asia. And he wants to know how we can help those emerging partners in those countries out while avoiding sort of the economic failures associated with sort of, the Washington consensus to sort of the DC think tank sort of mentality, right? The concern there is that those investment policies, the ones that are sort of America first, might push the new partners towards Russia and China, who are maybe offering worse deals, but maybe at what looks like a cheaper price. Is that something we should be concerned about? And if so, how can we empower and really, work closely with our allies in Africa and Asia and not alienate them and push them back to Russia and China?
If we bring manufacturing back to the United States, you won't have to worry about that. And here's why. The economy of America has been strong. It's going to remain strong. But if we have the manufacturing capabilities and manufacturing institutions that we saw, say, in the after World War II, that started being built up, I don't know that we'll see it exactly like that ever again. But when our economy does well, then Americans are quick to invest in other places. And I can assure you, Africa and Asia are going to be the two places they go with their money. They're not going to China. They're not going to Russia. They're not going to Europe because Europe's about at capacity. They're going to emerging places like Asia and like Africa from an investment standpoint. And I think it's only going to be extremely beneficial to those countries if we see the American economy and the American manufacturing sector get back into the boom years.
Right. Harold Moss, who asked one of the questions earlier, asked again, as an organization, NSI's mission is to expand national security knowledge and information. He's a technology leader, came out of Akamai. He wants to know what is a technology leader he can do to help you and your peers and folks in the Senate and the House today to really understand and align on the challenges on emerging technology in order to build excitement in the country so we can really compete against China. I presume he's talking about things like artificial intelligence, quantum computing, things that are hard to get around. We saw the Facebook hearings. It was, members of Congress, they're struggling with the technology. How can we help them get better at that and really get excited and get the country excited about what we need to in emerging technology to really get ahead of China?
Well, we need to get out and vote and get the right people in Congress, people who do know and understand that issue, because he's right. I mean, it is complicated, and every issue dealing with technology has very complex issues built into it. And policymakers only have so much time to deal with constituent issues, political issues, and then their respective committees of jurisdiction issue. But everybody needs to understand how critically important this is. And one thing that's going on out there right now that I'm pretty excited about is that we're seeing more people get involved, and this is on a bipartisan, from a bipartisan standpoint, get involved with trying to figure out a way to look at industries that we have lost, i.e., let's say chip manufacturing, and let's bring that back to America. John Cornyn's got a bill out there right now that he's working on that hopefully is going to be an amendment to the NDAA, maybe even in the next few weeks, that really does incentivize bringing chip manufacturing back to the United States. China does not have a corner on that, but if we're not careful, they could have, right, because Asia has a corner on that market right now. But there are things like that, and that's not typical for a guy like John. He's just made a commitment to study it, right? And he's learned, and now he's got some really good ideas, because people like NSI have been informing him, educating him, and saying, really, you ought to take a look at this, and here's what you can do. Let me tell you, folks on the Hill need to hear that from people in the community that know what they're talking about.
Well, that's a great note to end on. Senator, thank you so much for being here with us. I can't tell you how much we appreciate it. Folks online, I said we'd end on time, we will. Make sure to follow us on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn. Check out our Fault Lines podcast, and join us next week, in 2 weeks from now, same time, same place, for Mike Morrell, the Deputy Director of CIA. That'll be on June 25th at 5 p.m. Eastern. Senator, thank you once again. Really appreciate it. And thanks to all the audience for staying with us. Everybody have a great night. Thanks, Senator.
Thanks. Enjoyed it.